Good afternoon. As you can see on the screen, my name is Kenneth Janda. I am Professor Emeritus of Political Science here at Northwestern University. And I suppose you're wondering why I called you all together. I'm doing so under the authority of an act of Congress, which is signed by the President of the United States in December 2004. That law contained an amendment by Senator Robert C. Byrd of West Virginia requiring that all educational institutions that receive public funds offer an educational program about the U.S. Constitution on September 17th of each year. As you see by the screen, it's not September 17th, it's September 18th, but the United States government is clever in writing legislation, so if that date falls on a weekend, then we can do it either the previous weekend or the next week. So here we are at September 18th, 2006, and it's Constitution Day. You may have noticed my tie. It is not standard issue in my wardrobe, but one that I wear on special occasions like this. That law was passed in 2004, and last year in 2005 was the very first lecture given at Northwestern University on the Constitution under that legislation. My colleague, Jerry Goldman, gave the inaugural talk, and his talk was entitled, What Popular Culture Can Teach Us About the U.S. Constitution. You may recognize the reference to The Simpsons there. I'm not as cool as Jerry, and so today you're not going to be that lucky, and we'll do it in some other ways. Some of you probably already know a good deal about the Constitution. Can I see the hands of people here who have already taken the AP course in American government or a college course in American government? Can I see that? You see. Well, now I'm worried because now you probably know as much about it, if not more than I do. But because you already know about the Constitution a lot and about its history, I'm not going to describe it. I want to look at it more analytically and to see what it tried to do and whether it succeeded. And at the end, I'll speculate about what kind of democracy is produced in the United States. So let's take a look at my topic. The United States Constitution tried to decentralize power. And the question I'm asking is, did it succeed? Why pick September 17th as Constitution Day? Well, I'm going to do a little bit of a historical review here. Let's go relatively quickly in some dates for those of you who aren't quite sure whether or not the Constitution was last century or maybe the century before that. But the relevant dates are May 25th, 1787, when the Constitutional Convention was held in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Philadelphia at that time was the largest city in the United States, or in the colonies at that time. September 17th, the final draft was sent to Congress. Now, if you do a little math between those dates, as I was able to do with the spreadsheet program, excuse me, that takes into consideration dates, that's 116 days from the start of the Constitutional Convention to the delivery of the final draft sent to Congress. Now remember, the people working on the Constitution didn't have modern things like computers, didn't have laser printers, they didn't even have typewriters. In fact, they didn't even have ballpoint pens. So when you think back on it and you ask yourself, what could the United States Congress do nowadays in 116 days? Could it write a Constitution? I'm afraid that probably not. So that was, in and of itself, a remarkable achievement in terms of the length of time. Let's go quickly through sometimes because the dates here, because part of this, I think, is relevant to the understanding of the nature of the Constitution and what was actually written. The Constitution would go into effect after 9 of the 13 original colonies were to ratify it. Delaware was the first state to ratify it, barely 3 months later. Shortly thereafter, Pennsylvania came through, then New Jersey. By the beginning of 1788, Georgia signed on as the 4th state, and then Connecticut as the 5th state about a week later. Then a month later, Massachusetts. And April 28th, Maryland became the 7th state. Then South Carolina, May 23rd. June 21st, New Hampshire became the 9th state to ratify it. And so the Constitution really went into effect, technically. But if you look at some of these states, you'll say, where is Virginia? Where is New York? Two of the biggest states in the 13 colonies. And if they weren't going to sign on, then it's unlikely that the Constitution would have really been successful. The new government would have been successful. But a couple of days later, a few days later, June 25th, Virginia signed on as the 10th state to ratify, and then New York as the 11th. And then in March 4th, 1789, the Constitution actually went into effect. So we're talking about a process of a couple of years, but as I look back at that time, I'm really impressed by the speed by which this document was written, and then the various state legislatures ratified the document. And as I think about how long it takes things to go through Congress nowadays, when they're aided by computers and cell phones and other means of communication, I'm thoroughly impressed. North Carolina and Rhode Island, to complete it, finally signed on later on. When you read about the Constitution, by the way, Senator Byrd carries a copy of the Constitution in his breast pocket. It's a little short thing, you're able to slip in his pocket. When you think about the Constitution and realize that it's a really pretty brief document, it was done so short, it's probably worthwhile for us to take a look at some memorable facts about Constitution by comparing our Constitution with some others. First of all, age. It is arguably the world's oldest written Constitution. Now, some were written earlier than our Constitution. Some states had constitutions before that, but the state constitutions were all then revised after that, so they no longer counted as being the oldest ones. And some of the earlier constitutions, you can dig up some from Greek city-states, no longer existed. So it's probably arguably the world's oldest written constitution. Length, and I think this is even more interesting. It's arguably the world's shortest national constitution. There's only 4,300 words in the Constitution as it was written in 1787. Now, I know I said that the framers of the Constitution didn't have word processors, but suppose, just for the sake of argument, we can think of them writing this under Microsoft Word, and they're using Times Roman as a typeface, 12-point type. How long would it be? Barely 10 pages long. Now, at Northwestern, you freshmen are going to be assigned probably some papers of 10 pages. That won't be a long paper. You'll have some other ones that are much longer. You maybe have them 5 pages. But to think that if you had 10 pages, you yourself could write the Constitution of the United States. You have enough space to do that. So aim high. With the amendments of the Constitution, today it has about 7,800 words. That includes all 27 amendments. Now, I want to make a little bit out of the fact that it's such a short document. Let's compare this Constitution of 7,800 words, I'm throwing in the amendments now, with constitutions in other nations. Constitutions of federal nations tend to be much longer than the constitutions of unitary states. And of course, you know, the United States is a federal nation. The average length for federal nations for constitutions is almost 27,000 words. Ours is 7,800 words. For unitary states, 14,000 words. And American state constitutions are even twice as long as the U.S. Constitution. By the way, is anybody here who is an Indian citizen? Okay, well, you wouldn't want to carry your Indian Constitution in your breast pocket because it's over 95,000 words. And if you're from New Zealand, it's about 180,000 words. So, you know, when you think about it, the sheer fact that we've had a Constitution that's worked for so long, 216 years approximately, and it's been so short, I think deserves a good deal of attention. What about the fact that American constitutions are over twice as long as the U.S. Constitution? Here's some information about United constitutions comparing the American constitutions, the state constitutions, with national constitutions. 22% of all the state constitutions are over 36,000 words. And you can see this comparison, that compares with only 7% of the national constitution. Generally speaking, our state constitutions are enormous. And I think it's appropriate to ask why state constitutions might be so long in comparison with national constitutions. Remember, as national constitutions goes, ours is about the shortest. So let's take a little closer look at state constitutions. First of all, they were long originally when they were first written, and then they were very frequently amended. Alabama, 65,000 words in the Constitution, 726 amendments as of 1991. Those are the latest data that I really had handy, and I didn't bother to go back. Maybe it's over 800 now, I don't know, but the point, I think, is made. California, 21,000 words and 471 amendments. Oklahoma, as you can see, 58,000 words in the Constitution, 133 amendments. South Carolina, almost 22,000 words, 463 amendments. And Texas, a similar story, over 28,000 words and 463 amendments as of 1991. Why are state constitutions so long? First of all, in state constitutions, economic groups wrangled specific provisions to protect special interests. Now, remember I said at one point that the United States Constitution, when it was written, or I had it, I think, on the slide, said that it was also done in secrecy. So when these people gathered in Philadelphia to write the Constitution, they didn't have C-SPAN to broadcast their proceedings. They didn't even allow people from the newspapers, and there were newspapers in the time, to come in. Nor did they allow anybody from the outside. They literally worked in secrecy, which is no doubt one of the reasons why they were able to get done so quickly. But nowadays, if we try to write a constitution in secret, you can imagine the hue and cry that would go up from the people. It would demand complete coverage. We would be interviewing people when they came off the floor and say, Senator Jones, tell me what you thought about the provision on ethanol in the Constitution. He said, well, I wanted to make sure that my constituents back in Minnesota would make sure that they'd be able to sell their farm crop, and ethanol is very important. No doubt it would get in the Constitution. Let's see what happened in previous state constitutions. In California, state constitution managed to talk about fruit and nut trees and, of course, grapevines. Alabama, state constitution managed to talk about railroads. As a matter of fact, in almost all the state constitutions, there are specific provisions about railroads. In Illinois, we see fit to outlaw or to limit the kind of branch banking that you have. And in Oklahoma, they managed to write the Constitution in such a way that it talks about the manufacture and sale of denatured alcohol. My point is here that state constitutions, first of all, on one hand, they reflect in the Constitution the concern of a lot of special interest groups. Why are the special interest groups anxious to get their own formulations in the Constitution? Well, as you know, constitutions, although there are a lot of amendments, they're much more difficult to change than just ordinary statutes. So to the extent that you're able to get your economic interest represented in the Constitution, then you're more likely to preserve your economic interest over a longer period of time. But in addition to that, state constitutions are also prescriptive. That is, they spell out rules and regulations. Let me give you an example of the prescription. For example, the framers, when they wrote the Constitution, as I said before, they used few words, and what they tended to do is only outline what the essential governmental provisions were without spelling them out in great detail. For instance, the U.S. Constitution only says that the executive power should be vested in a president of the United States. Now, there's some more words about the executive power. But when you look at the U.S. Constitution, we'll find there's no mention about a cabinet. There is a reference, kind of an offhand reference, to something called principal officers of the executive departments, assuming that there will be some kind of executive department, but the Constitution doesn't specify what those are. And what we know over time is the fact that it isn't prescriptive and doesn't say that there should be this cabinet and this cabinet officer and that cabinet officer. It gives the United States government a lot of flexibility over time through legislation to be able to change the Constitution or change the cabinet structure. For instance, at one time in the United States we had a War Department. We now have a Defense Department. Now you might think there's not much difference between the War Department and the Defense Department, but it's at least symbolically a major difference. There actually are some reorganizational differences between the two. And when we were confronted by the terrorism threat, it made sense to establish a Cabinet Office of Department of Homeland Security. But we didn't have to worry about amending the Constitution in order to change the offices. Take a look at the Illinois State Constitution in contrast. It does say that the executive branch shall include a governor, a lieutenant governor, an attorney general, a secretary of state, a comptroller and treasurer elected by the electors of the state. Then it has 6 other sections spelling out what their officers are, what their duties are. When I teach American government, I often say, do you think that's important in the state of Illinois that we elect a Secretary of State? And typically I'll get from students, oh, yes, that's the democratic thing to do because the Secretary of State is a very important office. It supervises motor vehicle registration, driver's licenses. There's a lot of money involved in it. It's a very important office. People should be allowed to elect it. I say, what about the Secretary of State of the United States? Is that chopped liver? Yet we allow the President of the United States to appoint a Secretary of State. We don't say that we ought to be elected. And if the Secretary of State doesn't perform appropriately, how do we hold the Secretary of State accountable? We do that through the President. So we have more of a focus on the President as the main factor in controlling the behavior of the people in his own cabinet than we're willing to do on the state level. Nevertheless, if we were to try to suggest to the people of the state of Illinois that some of these officers should be appointed by the governor rather than elected, they would say, no, that's not very democratic. But nevertheless, we were able to do that fairly well with respect to the United States Constitution. So it outlines powers and limitations, and part because it only sets up a bare bones structure, it doesn't have to be changed as much. People who have studied the length of constitutions and the number of amendments find out that the longer the Constitution, the more amendments it generates. There's a statistically significant relationship between length of the Constitution and the number of amendments. The 27 amendments to the 1787 Constitution figures out to be less than 1 amendment a year, 0.13 amendment per year, whereas the average state constitution has been amended about 10 times as frequently, 1.23 times a year. So the Founding Fathers did something right. What led to the Constitutional Convention in the first place? Now I'm going to go quickly through these points because I'm sure they're points that you all have pretty much in mind, but I think I need to establish them just to make sure because it does lead to the nature of the Constitution. The colonists, as you know, rebelled against British rule in 1775. In the Declaration of Independence, they charged King George with absolute tyranny over these states. They won independence in 1781 under the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation reflected more of an alliance among rebel states than an actual government. In other words, these were states that had to in some way or other cohere in order to fight the Revolutionary War. But it really wasn't designed to be a very effective government among the states. The Articles' governmental weaknesses soon became apparent. And people have talked about the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, let me talk about 4 that seem to be pretty prominent in the minds of the people when they gathered at the Constitutional Convention in order to revise the Articles and create a new document. First of all, there was no power to tax, to raise taxes to fund the government. There was no provision for an office of individual leadership. That is, there's no one that you could point to that you could say represented, an individual that represented the United States of America. The government could not regulate interstate and foreign commerce, and it required unanimous consent of all 13 states to change. So, of these points, several of them suggest that there was a desire for a little bit more central coordination. For instance, some more power to try to raise funds so that you didn't have to beg the individual states to contribute to fund the operation of the central government, to regulate interstate and foreign commerce. So the meeting in 1787 was ostensibly to improve the government by, in effect, revising the Articles of Confederation, but instead the delegates wrote an entirely new constitution. Harkening back to their distrust of British rule and their concern with the central government in Britain and the fact that King George acted in a tyrannical manner toward the colonists, they still distrusted strong central rule. So they sought a decentralized government with more central coordination. So here was their dilemma. They wanted some degree of central coordination, but they're also very suspicious about centralized authority, so they had to try to come up with some kind of formula whereby they would balance out these conflicting criteria and get as much centralization as they wanted while also maintaining decentralization. So they really struck a balance between centralization and decentralization. And now we come really to the point that I want to talk about in terms of the analysis of the substance of the Constitution. I'm going to argue that there are 4 major decentralizing features in the Constitution. The ways in which the founders tried to produce decentralized authority lies, for the most part, in terms of these criteria: federalism, separation of powers, a bicameral Congress, and the electoral systems. And note, I have the electoral systems as 2, not 1, because in truth we operate under 2 different electoral systems in the United States. Let's take a look at federalism first. And the best way to understand the framers' approach to federalism is perhaps to take a look at it in comparison to the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation really constituted a union of states. And in the Articles of Confederation, as you read it, you will find that they formed a perpetual union of states and they guaranteed the sovereignty of states. The Constitution, as you look at it, doesn't even mention the word sovereignty. You get up one of the various sites for the Constitution on the internet and you do a word search for sovereignty, you won't find it. It didn't even mention it. As a matter of fact, the Constitution began saying, we the people of the United States, not we the several states gathered together, but we the people of the United States. So this wording is important because it already suggested that there was a shift. You're going away from an alliance or a confederation, if you will, of states joining together for some common purpose to a more thoroughgoing government based upon individuals, the citizens of the state. And it created a federal system with 2 levels of government. Now, a federal system, there were some federal systems at the time, but it's kind of a difficult concept to grasp. You say, in effect, all right, we're going to have government, and government means to control. We're going to try to control behavior at 2 different levels. We're going to have a national level of government that's going to be responsible for certain things, and we're going to have a state level that's responsible for other things. And so we're going to share powers or divide powers between these 2 levels. What kinds of things will the national government be responsible for? Well, obviously defense against foreign enemies. But the state governments, on the other hand, were to exercise what's known in the trade as police powers. That is, they would safeguard citizens' health, morals, their safety, and the welfare. For the most part, this means that it was the state governments that were empowered to act directly on people in preserving their health, moral safety, and welfare, but not the national level of government. The national government can act in those areas, and so-called police power areas, only with state cooperation. So, for example, the national government might induce state participation in a program, a highway program. For example, by saying, now, if you build such and such a highway according to this plan to connect the highways in other states, then we will fund 80% of the highway. And as a matter of fact, that, of course, is the basis of the interstate highway system. It's a national plan that was supported by the Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower, but the goal was to have this dual level of cooperation between the national level and the state level. Similarly, education traditionally has been an area only for states, but you may know something about Bush's plan for No Child Left Behind. Some people don't recognize that, but that is really a major encroachment into an area that had traditionally been left to the American states. So by setting up a set of national testing norms for the states, and then by requiring states to meet that, the national government and the plan, in effect, started to push the national government to a traditional state area. And it also did it really without providing that much funding. Some funding was provided, but many states will say that the problem of unfunded mandates, that there really isn't enough federal money to deliver on the policies that it calls for. But the basic point here is that as a result of federalism, the government powers were indeed decentralized and dispersed over both powers, both forms of government, the state and the national government. Separation of powers, almost on its face, is an example of decentralization of power. Governmental powers were divided over 3 branches. You know that the Constitution said that the executive power, the legislative power shall be in the Congress, the executive power shall be in the President of the United States, and that the judicial power shall be in the Supreme Court. Each branch could also check the others. So there, for example, the President of the United States has to sign legislation, although Congress passes the legislation. If the President doesn't sign the legislation, it's considered a veto, but the Congress can pass it over the veto of the President's veto. Similarly, there are checks and balances that are related between the Congress and the Supreme Court, and between the President and the Congress. For example, another for instance is that although the President is allowed to negotiate treaties, the treaties have to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate. So this is the sort of thing that we tend to think about is endemic to our system. We have separation of powers, we have checks and balances, but realize that this is in effect a decentralization of power. Decentralization of power really complicates lawmaking in the United States. Because the President may initiate some legislation, may suggest some legislation to Congress, nevertheless, the President has to get the cooperation of Congress to pass that legislation, as opposed to many other parliamentary democracies, many of which are parliamentary systems. There is no separation of powers. Very often when I teach the American government class, I ask people to tell me what they consider to be a distinguishing characteristic of democracy. And typically I'll find someone say, well, a distinguishing characteristic of democracy is separation of powers. What do you mean by that? That you cannot have a democracy without the separation of powers? And the typical response to that is, yes, that's right. Separation of powers is necessary for democratic government. And then, of course, the next question is, well, so you say that Britain does not have a democratic form of government, because Britain does not have the kind of separation powers that we have in the United States. In fact, the legislative and the executive power are joined in Great Britain. And indeed, it's joined in most other parliamentary democracies throughout the world, and most democracies are parliamentary democracies. That means that there's a higher degree of centralization of powers in other democratic nations than there is in the United States. So lawmaking, as a consequence, becomes simpler in most other democracies with parliamentary systems. We also require a bicameral legislature. Now, this is not a new idea, and about half the nations today do have bicameral legislatures. But few have two chambers that are equal in power. What's distinctive about the legislature in the United States is that the House and the Senate, although they have some different powers according to the Constitution, for example, the framers of the Constitution said that only revenue bills can only originate in the House of Representatives. Well, why? Because that's the popular House. The House of Representatives are based upon population, and people pay the taxes. And so, therefore, revenue bills can only originate in the House. But the Senate has some special powers, too. As I mentioned before, the treaties have to be approved in the Senate of the United States. But those are relatively small. The important point about the two chambers in the United States is that when a piece of legislation comes to the President of the United States for signature, it has to be passed in exactly the same form in the House and the Senate. And if it's not passed in exactly the same form, it doesn't get presented. So that requirement of the Constitution really makes the two chambers equal in population, in powers. So dividing legislative powers between two chambers further decentralizes power. Now, I said before we had two electoral systems in the United States. The president is chosen not in a national election, but in a federal election. That is, the votes, as you very well know, when you realize the outcome of the 2000 election between George Bush and Al Gore got about 500,000 more votes nationwide than George Bush did. Nevertheless, George Bush was elected President of the United States. And why? Well, that's because it's not a national election. It's a federal election. That is, people vote for the president is chosen by the Electoral College. And if you win a state, you get all that state's electoral votes. And the number of electoral votes, of course, varies according to the size of the state. So this means that when people campaign for the presidency, they're fully aware that they have no need to have a true national campaign. They only look at the states that they think that they can win and concentrate on those states. And that, in a peculiar way, contributes to the decentralization of power, because you don't have to appeal to the entire nation. You appeal only to the segments of the nation that you think are going to contribute to electoral victory. The members of Congress themselves are chosen in state and local elections. I say state elections, if you're running for the senator, you're chosen in the state election, or election at the state level. If you're running for Congress, you're chosen in a district election, so I'm calling that a local election. This encourages decentralization. And you might say, how does it, and how else could you do it? Well, some of you are probably familiar with the principle of proportional representation. And in most parliamentary democracies, they follow this principle. That is, votes are cast not for individual candidates, but they're cast for parties. And if a party gets 25% of the votes, they get 25% of the seats. So the candidates for parliament are more or less anonymous, other than the top people, the ones who are leading their parties. In the United States, it's a very different situation. Each election is discrete, and so members of the Senate and members of the House who are seeking election try to campaign based upon principles that will seek them, who return them to Congress, and that means then that there's a decentralization of powers, because the members want to try to cultivate the support within their own constituencies. So both electoral systems, I would argue, decentralize political powers in the United States. Okay, those are the things that you probably already picked up from, if you looked at the Constitution in the past, and you realize certainly federalism, and you've heard that the separation of powers tends to decentralize power in the United States. So those 4 points you probably are aware of. But it turns out that there are some centralizing institutions in the United States government. And the ironic thing about this is that really these came out to be centralizing institutions not essentially because the framers wanted them to be centralizing. Remember I said they basically distrusted authority. So they really weren't looking in particular for ways to centralize power. But they did feel it necessary to have a president. They did think it's necessary to have a Supreme Court. They certainly didn't think it was necessary to have political parties or a party system because they didn't have that idea. But let's see how these three institutions in the United States did serve to centralize power. First of all, the presidencies. Let's take a look again at words, because I feel very strongly that length or the amount of attention given to an institution reflects the importance of the institution. The framers devoted over 2,000 words, nearly half of the entire Constitution, to the Congress in Article 1. And as a matter of fact, when you think about it, Article 1, they begin the whole Constitution of the United States of America by talking about the legislature, talking about the Congress, and they spend half their time talking about it. What about the presidency? Barely 1,000 words to create the executive in Article 2. Many delegates, in fact, saw the presidency as kind of a necessary office to have, but it was an administrative office. So, you know, it'd be nice to have a president. It'd be nice to have a president to cut ribbons at some kind of opening of some post office, or some represent the United States or abroad. And so it's important to have an individual to do that. But they didn't really see the presidency as a center of power in the United States. But it turns out that over time, the president did become the central power in the United States, central focus. The president now defines national goals. The president proposes legislation to achieve those goals. It sends Congress a budget to fund national legislation, and of course, speaks to the nation in global affairs. Now, originally, the framers thought that it'd be the Congress that would define the goals. It was thought that it would be the Congress that would prepare the budget. And indeed, for about 150 years of our history, the Congress did take the leadership on that. And it wasn't until 1921 when Congress passed something called, you'll love this, the Budgeting and Accounting Act of 1921. It gave the President of the United States the responsibility to prepare the budget. Now think about that for just a minute. Sometimes people talk about the president grabbing power, taking power and bringing it into the executive. In many cases, the Congress says, look, we're just not set up to do this. We're just not set up to prepare a budget. 435 members in the House, almost 100 members in the Senate back in 1921. They said, we just can't do this. We need more central focus. So they empowered the President of the United States to prepare a budget, and as you know now, the President gives an annual budget message to the Congress, sends the budget to the Congress, and the Congress can say, we can do that. We can work with the budget that you send us, and we'll revise it. And the Congress, in fact, does revise it. But note the fundamental shift. Now the President has this new power to decide what are the primary objectives of the United States in terms of spending policy. And this also contributed to the centralization of power. The Supreme Court. The framers really lacked any clear vision of the judicial branch. They felt it was necessary to have one, but look at the sequence. Article 1 dealt with the Congress. Article 2 dealt with the executive. Article 3, already third in place, dealt with the Supreme Court. And how much attention did they give it? 400 words. And in fact, it says that there shall be a Supreme Court. And then it also said that Congress shall have the authority to create subordinate courts. Now we know that the Supreme Court is very important in the United States. Now we know that the Supreme Court is at least equal in authority to the other two branches. But that didn't come until really late as a result of a Supreme Court decision in a case called Marbury versus Madison, when the court claimed for itself the power of judicial review. That is, the court said that it would judge the constitutionality of presidential and congressional acts. And as a result of that, we have a situation now where we have the Supreme Court as being really the final governmental say. In our political system, you see that if you don't get what you want from the House of Representatives, maybe you can go over to the Senate and work with them. And if you can't get what you want from Congress, maybe you can go to the President. And if you can't get it at the national level, maybe you can go and work with the state legislatures. If the state legislatures aren't cooperating, maybe you can work through Congress. So we have different kind of levels. There's almost no one in our political system now can say, this is it, this is the final word, except the Supreme Court. And when the Supreme Court speaks out on very complicated policies, such as, for example, Brown versus the Board of Education declaring segregation illegal, or in Roe versus Wade in 1973, saying that women had a right to choose for abortion, to abortion. For all practical purposes, that settled the issue. Now, indeed, it is not completely settled in the United States. The Supreme Court decision is being worked on to be overturned, but you see what a long process that is. The final arbiter in American political system is, for all practical purposes, the Supreme Court. Now, those two institutions that came out to be centralizing forces, presidency and Supreme Court in the United States, the framers had no idea that they were going to work out that way. There's another institution, the two-party system, that the framers weren't even aware of. So parties did not exist in 1787, and they were not mentioned in the Constitution. As a matter of fact, if you take a look at any of the amendments since then, they're still not mentioned in the Constitution. The Constitution, according to Electoral College, gave the presidency to the person who got a majority of votes in the Electoral College. Okay, that settled the presidency. Who's going to become vice president? The vice presidency went to the runner-up. Now that's kind of a naive conception of democracy. It's a little bit like your third grade when you had a couple of people running for class officer, and Shirley and Tommy were the two candidates, and Shirley won, and she became class officer, and Tommy, because he's second place, he became runner-up. He became vice president for the class, and that seemed to work all right at the third grade. It certainly doesn't work very well in the United States government. For example, in 1796, the election at that time had two opposing presidential candidates that were really aligned with political parties. John Adams was a Federalist, and Thomas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican. Adams won. He had to accept Thomas Jefferson as his vice president. Now think about that. That's like as if in 2004, George Bush won the presidency and took not, I always forget his name, I went block on it for some time, Dick Cheney, yeah, right. Not Dick Cheney as his vice president, but John Kerry. So you can imagine a situation in which you have George Bush as president and John Kerry as vice president, not really designed to further a government. So the founding fathers, still many of them around at that time, recognized that, and the 12th Amendment of the Constitution required electors to vote separately in the Electoral College for president and vice president, and that led to party tickets. Why are parties a centralizing force? Well, once you render things apart, as the Constitution did, and you say, okay, you've got separate powers for the president and for the Congress in particular, and the House and the Senate, then you need something to sort of put them together. And parties arose because this is not only a way to help people get elected, but there's also a way to coordinate government policies. So the political parties, in effect, did the bonding, if you will, between like-minded people within the Congress and the presidency to coordinate. And of course, that bonding then provides for a kind of centralization. The power is not so much decentralized any longer because you have this centralizing force of the political parties. The fact that we only have two parties today that govern also contributes to centralization of power. Again, when I teach American government, I find that students are suspicious of a two-party system. And I think we ought to have more choice. As a matter of fact, if you put the question to a sample of American citizens and ask, you think it would be better that we had, would you like to have more than two major party candidates choices at election? They'll say, yeah, I like a lot of them, lots of choices. And so there's sort of this bias for a major choice. But we've had a two-party system in the United States, and we've had a democracy in the United States for about 200 years. And the question arises, is it that we've had a democracy in the United States in spite of the fact we've had a two-party system, or we've had a stable democracy in the United States because we've had a two-party system? And I think the evidence is such that it might actually be because we've had a two-party system. Now, if you wonder about that, you might think about what it might be like if you had multiple parties now in the United States Congress. Suppose you didn't have just the Democrats and Republicans. Suppose you actually had multiple parties. What would be the kinds of parties you might expect? Got the Democrats and Republicans, and there'd probably be a Green Party, okay? And there'd probably be a Christian evangelical party, and there might be a black party, and there might be a Latino party, and there might be, well, I'll let your imagination run wild on this. But my guess is that you'd have multiple parties in the Congress of the United States, and then just do a little mind experiment of your own and ask yourself whether or not be more likely to make coherent public policy if we had multiple parties in the United States Congress as opposed to just two. Well, the evidence isn't exactly clear on that, but I think it's something that you ought to think about it. Okay, did the Constitution create a democracy? Democracy was a feared concept in the 1780s. And in fact, if you were to ask the founders, that they would say the one thing we want to avoid is a democracy. Because over in Europe at that time, the French Revolution had a form of mob rule, which a lot of people interpreted as democratic rule, as democracy. And so what they sought was a republic. Now, a republic differs from a democracy. A republic is based upon the idea that there's no hereditary ruler. That's the main idea. So therefore, the power somehow or other derives from the consent of the governed. So the people are in some way involved in this. But they really sort of govern indirectly. They select people to govern for themselves. It's a representative kind of democracy. They select maybe informed people, upstanding people in the community to make decisions on behalf of the whole community. So the framers sought a republic. They certainly didn't want to create a democracy. However, they did fear concentrating power in any political institution, and that act of dividing authority served their view of popular government, and it turns out that it also served one model of democracy. Now, I'm going to now talk about a couple of models, and I'll close with this, a couple of models of democracy that come out of American experience, contemporary experience, and they certainly weren't what the founders had in mind. But the two contemporary models of democracy are the majoritarian model and the pluralist model. In the majoritarian concept of democracy, government should do what a majority of the people want it to do. Now, once again, reflect on that. If government is to do what a majority of the people want it to do, it has to be organized to carry it out. And so implicit in the majoritarian concept of democracy, which is essentially a kind of a textbook argument, government will do what a majority of people want, it really suggests that you have centralization of power. So once the people speak, you carry out that policy. You don't want divided authority. Divided authority only stops government from carrying out policy. You want to carry out the policy. We don't have that in the United States. The Constitution doesn't create that kind of governmental structure. But there is an alternative model which really fits the Constitution very well. And that's a model of pluralist democracy. And under this model, the idea is that you should just keep a government open. Make sure in a government that you have multiple centers of power so that people who are seeking kind of governmental action, some redress of grievances or governmental action, protection of their interests, can actually get into the government, perhaps as I said before, at the state level, or maybe at the national level, maybe in the House, maybe in the Senate, maybe in one committee in the House or another committee in the House, maybe in the presidency's office. But in other words, keep it open so you have lots of opportunities for competing groups to make their case to government. And that's, in effect, what was achieved when, through the process of decentralizing power in the United States, the Founding Fathers, in effect, created a pluralist democracy, although they didn't really expect it. Okay, lecture's over. Now I'm going to talk about your homework. You really didn't expect that you're going to come to a lecture at Northwestern without having a homework assignment. So let me outline it for you right now. First task, choose a friend at Northwestern. It's a two-person, remember these assignments where you work in teams. This is a team assignment. Choose a friend at Northwestern. And imagine that you are delegates at a constitutional convention. Each of you write a new constitution under 5,000 words that produces a better form of government. And that's about 10 pages. Remember, we talked about the length of constitutions. 10-page paper, you ought to be able to handle that. When you're finished, exchange papers, grade each other's work. Now, I know you'd like that. I know that's a feature that you'd like. Grade each other's work and discuss. And try to think whether or not your new constitution is any better than the one we have. And in what way is it? Does it promote majoritarian democracy? Does it promote pluralist democracy better than what we have? I think you're going to have to go a long way to produce a better constitution and promote pluralist democracy. But anyway, do those things, and then after you discuss it, happy Constitution Day. Welcome to Northwestern. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you. I want to excuse anybody who wants to leave right now, but I'm willing to stay around to answer questions if anybody else wants to ask them. But I know scheduling is often tight, and I encourage you to leave if you want to. But if you've got any questions, raise your hand and let's try to deal with them. Yes?
Why there are only two major parties in USA?
Well, there are a couple of reasons as to why that happened. The major one has to do with the rules in the electoral system. And maybe I should go back so that I'm under the lights. Game theory structures the rules of a game. You play games differently depending on what the rules are. So, for example, in American sports, if it turns out that you get more points for kicking a field goal than for scoring a touchdown, people will kick field goals instead of scoring touchdowns. I mean, they'll play the game that way. The way the electoral system is set up in the United States, the major prize is the presidency. And in order to win that, you have to get more votes than anybody else. That inevitably tends to coalesce groups in the two camps, because there's not much chance for a third party, to try to get enough votes to the other. There's always a dynamic that really forces people to coalesce so that you have really two groups. And that's a major argument. That's for the presidency. There's another argument that can be made for the individual races for Congress, but it's pretty much the same thing. Under what's called a first-past-the-post system, what we have in the United States is, it's a British phrase that comes up from a race. So you have a race between a series of people. Who's the winner? The first person who passes the post. That means, as you apply it to politics, the candidate who gets more votes than anyone else in an electoral contest is a winner. Once again, there's a pressure to try to coordinate so that you have only two groups, because the third parties just don't do very well. So there's always a pressure to have two candidates. So that's the basic argument on that. Then there's another argument after that, that there's a socialization process in the United States and that so many people already, through their parents, identify with either the Democrats or Republicans, you tend to continue that. So, in effect, it's hard, there's not much room for other parties because people are already committed to parties. It's a little bit like the problem of soccer in the United States. One of the reasons why soccer isn't a more popular sport is that people are already, their passions are taken up with baseball or with football or with basketball, and there's not enough room to take up another sport. Now, the analogy is not perfect, and soccer is growing in popularity, but it's nowhere near the popularity of the other three sports. That would be the general argument. Okay. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you think that the events of September 11th have contributed to either centralization or decentralization?
Oh, centralization without any question whatsoever, yeah. And it has to fit in with the concept of order, as I mentioned. Oh, the question had to deal with September 11th. Did September 11th contribute to centralization or decentralization? And clearly, it enhanced the powers of the President of the United States and also the powers of government generally. So now there's a tendency to believe that rather than protect the rights of the individual, it's okay if we're apt to get some information on terrorists, even though we have to listen to private phone conversations of people, that's the adequate price to pay. And so that means it increases more government, and the government essentially is centralized in the President of the United States. There's absolutely no question about that in my mind. Yes?
Do you believe that the holding of Marbury versus Madison was an inevitable consequence of the Founders' Constitution, or is it conceivable that we could have had a judiciary that took on a much different character than what we have now?
Oh, I think it's clearly possible that we could have had a different judiciary, certainly not at that particular time. Now, it remains to be seen whether, 50 years, 25, 50, 100 years later, that the dynamics sort of worked out so that something like Marbury versus Madison would have been passed. But clearly at that particular point in time, the United States Congress, the Supreme Court was not a revered institution. There were several people who were appointed to be Chief Justices of the Supreme Court, and they turned it down. They thought it wasn't an important office. And so it was a stroke on the part of John Marshall, Chief Justice at the time, to fashion this decision, and it becomes very complicated, the decision. I won't try to put it in here, but in effect, he's denying, what he did in that decision is deny the court some powers that were being given to it by Congress because he says the Congress doesn't have the right to give that power. And note what happened. Then it put the court in a position to declare an act of Congress unconstitutional, and then it gave the court even more powers. So it was a bold stroke, and clearly coming so early as it did, it really set the court on a trajectory to become very powerful in American politics. But it could have gone a different way, because the Constitution certainly, you'll find people argue both ways, but the Constitution certainly doesn't say that the court should have that power. Okay, time for one, maybe two more questions, one over there and then the other.
From such a form of government like the U.S. had in the Articles, couldn't it be argued that the Constitution was certainly essentially centralizing all the states rather than decentralizing power?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, my colleague and co-author Jerry Goldman made that argument earlier today. I gave this lecture this morning, and Jerry Goldman said, I'll take issue with what you said. It was actually the Constitution was a centralizing. Well, yeah, I think in certain ways you can say that the framers wanted a stronger national government. There's no question about that. And so they did produce a slightly stronger national government. But my point is, yeah, they did, but what they did do in creating this new government is preserve the decentralization of power. So they went a little bit in that direction, but they ultimately preserved decentralization. So that's what I told Jerry, and I guess that's what I'll tell you. Okay. Last question.
You spoke about how the two-party system and our government works hand in hand, but especially now with the polarization of the two parties, don't you think that a lot of people slip through the cracks and are therefore alienated and don't participate in politics because of the nature of the two-party system?
No, I didn't say that the two parties in government work hand in hand. What I did say was the parties provide kind of a centralizing force for the government. And so, well, let's think of it this way. President Bush, through the early part of his administration, when he proposed a piece of legislation, he could count on Republicans in the House and the Senate to back him up, all right? So it was that kind of centralization. Now, if these people didn't belong to the same party, if the president and the leadership of the House and the Senate were not of the same party, my guess is that Bush wouldn't have gotten everything he wanted. But in effect, the party system provided the capacity for centralization. Now, what you're asking the question is, when the parties are at loggerheads, as they are now, doesn't that have a different kind of spillover effect on the part of the people? And I certainly think you're right. And I do think it has an alienating effect and so on. And so that makes an argument for parties being, that parties don't facilitate democratic government. But I wouldn't go that way. I said you can't really find any nation in the world that anybody's willing to say is a democracy, or at least some semblance of democracy, that doesn't have a party system and a competitive party system and a strong competitive party system. Places that don't have that, either one party system or, as they tried in Uganda recently, and still do, having a no party system, it usually means just dictatorship. So politics is not perfect. And whenever you're talking about clashes of interest, you have problems. But it appears to be that the best way to manage these clashes of interest is through some kind of competitive party system. And so that's the argument that I would say in a broad scheme of things, political parties are absolutely necessary. And I do think that in the United States, they do operate to promote coordination between the House and the Senate and between the presidency and Congress. Now, we have an election coming up in 2006. And if the Democrats take the House and the Senate, or even one of just the House, then you'll find that there's no coordination between the two, which in a curious way sort of proves my point. You know, that it's the fact that when you have government under control of the same party, you tend to get the centralization.